Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining today's press briefing on the crisis in Ukraine, hosted by the Committee to Protect Journalists and Human Rights Watch. My name is Gypsy Kaiser. I am the Advocacy and Communications Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I'll be moderating today's briefing. Since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many of you have been hearing from the governments that are working hard to secure peace. Today, on the 23rd day of the war, we want to give you an update on what is happening to human rights and press freedom in Ukraine. How people get information and exercise their rights during war is often a matter of life and death. That is why our organizations are joining today in giving you an assessment of human rights and press freedom developments in Ukraine and beyond. For today's discussion, I'm pleased to welcome my colleagues, Rachel Denber, who is the Deputy Director of Europe and Central Asia at Human Rights Watch, Frederike Kaltheuner, who is the Director of Technology and Human Rights at Human Rights Watch, Gulnoza Said is the Europe and Central Asia Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Colin Pereira, who is the Journalist Safety Specialist at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Each of them will make brief remarks, after which we will move to Q&A. Please find their bios and other relevant links to our discussion in the chat. Please remember that we have simultaneous interpretation into Russian, and there is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to switch on that interpretation if you need it. We will start with Rachel Denber. Rachel, the floor is yours, please.
Gypsy, thank you so much. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be on this panel and to talk about what is an incredibly important and urgent issue. We're in the third week of war following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Human Rights Watch has been on the ground from the very beginning in Ukraine, documenting the impact of the war on civilians. We have a team there that has been in Lviv and in other locations, documenting the conduct of the war. And so far, as I think everybody knows, the war has taken a devastating toll on civilians. 780 civilian deaths so far, 3 million refugees who have crossed borders, many more who are displaced within Ukraine. It's really an unspeakable toll. Almost from the very beginning of the invasion, we started documenting violations of international humanitarian law, indiscriminate bombing, indiscriminate shelling, the use of cluster munitions, the use of explosive weapons with wide area impact in densely populated cities. And as the invasion has continued, as the Russian forces have, military action has become stalled on the ground, the use of explosive weapons and with wide area impact, these violations of international humanitarian law have really stepped up in these densely populated cities, including also with aerial bombardments, artillery fire, cluster munitions. All of that has been stepping up in recent days as the invasion is stalling. We have documented, Human Rights Watch has documented indiscriminate bombing and shelling in numerous cities, in Kharkiv, the second largest city, in Kiev, in Vuhledar, Chernihiv, Mariupol, Irpin, Mykolaiv, and other places. Amnesty International has done extremely important documentation as well in other cities as well. So I think our top concern has been the killing and maiming of civilians, the destruction of homes, hospitals, schools, shops, and the just damage and destruction of important civilian infrastructure. People cannot flee because they fear getting hit by shelling. They can't flee in safety, and face tremendous hardships when they have to stay behind. And we saw that, and we're seeing that getting played out right now, obviously in Mariupol, but in other places as well. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rachel. We will now turn to Frederike.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this introduction and for the important work you and your team are doing. It's a great honor to speak here today. I'll add to what Rachel has already explained by explaining the three ways in which the tech division has monitored the conflict and the war and what insights we're observing. So there are three streams of work that we've been doing in the past 3 weeks. The first one is the Digital Investigations Lab has been working very closely with researchers on the ground and helped in fact-finding. There are countless of examples of the work, but just today, the lab published a piece with Rachel's teams on the attacks in Kharkiv in early March over time. I think to me, this shows the crucial importance that open source and digital investigations methods have in fact-finding, especially when it is so dangerous for journalists to be present. The second stream of work is we've been monitoring very closely and analyzing how companies such as Meta, Google, TikTok, Twitter, or Telegram have responded to the war, such as by tackling disinformation, content moderation decisions, geo-blocking, as well as removing and demoting content. Our key message in this work is that the war in Ukraine has surfaced what Human Rights Watch and many of our partners have documented over the years. Companies have chronically underinvested in addressing the human rights issues in many of the countries where people rely on their products and services. And in this regard, Ukraine is no exception. Companies should exhibit more clarity, consistency, and transparency so that their actions can be assessed against their human rights responsibilities. We found this very difficult in some of the responses to make a full assessment because decisions were made very quickly, ad hoc, and not always in ways that are transparent. And all of this matters because many of the social media's actions during the war in Ukraine, such as taking down accounts, geo-blocking, or removing or demoting content, have implications for freedom of expression. We think that social media and messaging companies need to do much more to meet their human rights obligations, and not just in Ukraine, but also in the many other crises and conflicts around the world. The second work stream, mostly done by Rachel's team, but also in close collaboration, is we've been tracking very closely how leading foreign companies have withdrawn from Russia or suspended their operations. The key message here for us is both foreign tech companies and governments should very carefully assess how their actions may contribute to the eradication of remaining online freedoms in Russia. And they need to take steps to mitigate undue restrictions based on their human rights responsibilities. So we see three separate reasons for the fact that companies are withdrawing. I think one is the sanctions themselves are too broad and sometimes unclear. So that this applies to both US sanctions, but also EU sanctions that mention dual-use technology specifically. So it's unclear to what extent the sanctions allow companies to continue providing technologies. And together with 10 human rights organizations, including the Center for the Protection of Journalists, we signed on a letter urging the Biden administration in the US, seeking sanction on Russian to make sure that Russians keep connected to the internet. We still think this is just one part of the puzzle, it's the sanctions. But at the same time, we're also seeing that some companies are overly cautious or over-compliant in their interpretations of the sanctions. And then finally, another reason is that technology has really become part of infrastructure. So we're seeing when a company like Google leaves the market or Apple, it means that people can no longer use services like Apple Pay. So that's something to really think about. What do sanctions mean at a time when tech companies or private companies really are providers of infrastructure? And I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions or follow-ups you may have.
Thank you, Frederike. We will now move on to Gulnoza Said from the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Yes, thank you, Gypsy. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for listening to us today. It's a very important time for Ukraine. We at CPJ have been monitoring and documenting press freedom violations, including attacks on journalists with the dedicated 24/7 team, including a person in Ukraine. We're also assisting journalists affected by this conflict in Ukraine and outside. Just a few stats that we've seen and documented until now. 4 journalists have been killed, 2 local and 2 foreign, in the first 3 weeks of the full-scale war. Yevgeny Sakun was the first casualty. He was killed on March 1st when Russian forces shelled the TV tower in Kiev. And on March 13, a US reporter, Brent Renault, was shot and killed, and the photographer Juan Arredondo was injured in Irpin, not far from Kiev. And the next day, on March 14, Fox News cameraman Pierre Zakshevsky and Fox News producer, local journalist Alexandra Kuvshinova were killed, and correspondent Benjamin Hall was seriously injured. And we also documented many incidents of journalists being shot at. Several of them were wounded. They include crews from Danish newspaper, Extra-Bladet, British media outlets, an accident involving a Swiss journalist, but also local journalists, for example, the Ukrainian broadcaster Hromadsky. Also, there were various incidents involving journalists from CNN Turk and Czech journalists, in which journalists were shot at but escaped unharmed. And it's very important to reiterate that all parties at this war must recognize that all journalists and media workers are civilians and must be protected under international humanitarian law, and targeting them, especially in incidents which we documented when they were wearing press insignia or were in vehicles marked as press, is a violation of international law, and violators must be held accountable. I already mentioned the case of Sakun, who was killed in the Kiev TV tower shelling, and we saw that Russian forces have targeted what they call the information infrastructure by shelling and bombing television towers in Kharkiv, Lysychansk, Berdyansk. Broadcasts were interrupted for some time in some of those incidents, but resumed soon after. But when TV towers were physically taken over by Russian troops, as it happened on March 4th in Kharkiv and Mariupol, they started broadcasting Russian state TV channels. Media equipment, telecommunications, and broadcasting infrastructure are very essential for access to information, and these facilities must remain intact and treated as civilian facilities. And we've seen that the truth is targeted in this war. Disinformation is being used. We documented the cases when Russian forces have detained dozens of journalists and attempted to force them to produce pro-Russian propaganda. And another very huge impact of this conflict is on journalistic community that goes beyond Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in massive displacement and exile of journalists. Even before the full-scale war that started on February 24th, newsrooms were preparing. They started relocating their staff from Kiev to Western Ukraine. The prep work also included procuring personal protective equipment for their correspondents, working on their websites, to make them safer for DDoS attacks and hacking. And some were looking for new offices that would have shelters in the same building or nearby. Most journalists, Ukrainian journalists, remained in the country, but I mean, relocated to Western Ukraine, but many media outlets have also fled. Male Ukrainians, as you probably know, cannot leave. It was announced early on in the war. And on March 3rd, the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, approved the presidential decree on general mobilization. And journalists are not exempt from mobilization. And we at CPJ believe that it's important that Ukraine should exempt male journalists from compulsory military service. They should be able to continue reporting on the war. And as I said, there have been other groups of journalists who fled Ukraine. There was a very sizable Belarusian journalistic community who relocated to Ukraine after the crackdown on media following the August 2020 presidential elections and subsequent repressions. And we have heard about more than 100 Belarusian journalists who fled Ukraine. But unlike Ukrainian journalists fleeing Ukraine, Belarusian journalists are sometimes in a more vulnerable position because they don't have visas to European countries, and the number of countries they can go to is very limited. And we also are aware of the case of many Tajik journalists who have lived and worked in Ukraine in recent years. They also thought they were safe from persecution by their own authoritarian government until the war started. And now they are looking for safe haven elsewhere. When talking about Ukrainian journalists, I also wanted to highlight the plight of Crimea. Since Russia occupied and annexed Crimea in 2014, media outlets were closed, Russian state media outlets replaced the Ukrainian ones, and journalists were jailed. There are at least 4 Crimean journalists behind bars right now. On March 10, one of the Crimean Tatar journalists, Remzi Bakirov, was sentenced to 19 years in prison. A month earlier, on February 16, Russian court in Crimea sentenced RFRL journalist Vladislav Yesipenko to 6 years in prison. And the international community should continue to demand that Russia release these journalists. Let me stop here, and then I can answer questions or give more comments on Russia and media freedom violations there since the war started.
Thank you, Gulnoza. We will now move quickly to Colin Pereira, who is with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you.
Hello, thanks, Gypsy, and nice to be here. I'll be very quick. So what I'm doing is I am helping a number of journalists, news organizations, and news outlets on the ground in the Ukraine and elsewhere in the region deal with the granular detail of covering a war of this nature. This is a conventional war with urban warfare, the likes of which we probably haven't seen since the Second World War. So we are educating journalists to what that actually means on a tactical battle basis, and what they are seeing when the Russians perform certain movements and certain actions, which sometimes are perceived to be illogical, but actually, if you understand Russian military doctrine, make perfect sense. And at the same time, there is a phrase in militaries around the world that that amateurs talk about fighting and professionals talk about logistics. That's very much the case in terms of challenges facing journalists today. We're working with them on a granular level to help them in terms of transportation around the country, in terms of fuel, in terms of accommodation, in terms of local support. That means local producers and drivers and facilitators, and in terms of insurance, in terms of the right equipment, that's body armor, and also because of the chemical, biological, radiation threat, it's CBRN kits. And we are helping them with insurance, which is increasingly becoming hard to get and is going to become a big point of contention. So I'm speaking very fast, which I apologize to the translators, but there's a lot of granular detail going on. And I would just like to also say, people need to understand that this conflict is really, will be felt much further than the borders of Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine and Russia are the bread baskets of the Middle East and Africa. We are seeing price hikes in the price of bread across the Middle East and Africa, and we are seeing protests related to that in Algeria, Nasiriyah in Iraq, and potentially in Egypt. It's got to be remembered that 20% of the calorie intake of Egypt, which is the most populous nation in the Middle East, is based on Russian and Ukrainian grain. If you think about the impact of that, the Arab Spring was actually started by the price of bread. So if this conflict keeps running the way it is, there will be protests and conflict in other parts of the world, which will affect journalists all around the region and far afield. And we're prepping them for that impact day, because if we wait for it to happen, it will be too late.
Thank you very much, Colin. And it's important to keep that broader perspective on the repercussions of this conflict, which we know will certainly go beyond. We're now going to open up for questions and answers. We have an expanded panel beyond the people that you just heard that are available for the Q&A section. And I'm going to just introduce them very quickly. We have my colleague Lucy Westcott, who is the Emergencies Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Lucy can speak to the kinds of assistance that we're giving, the hurdles that we're facing. There's lots of issues with financial flows and so on, among other areas. We have Lou Charbonneau, who is the United Nations Director at Human Rights Watch, and Lou can speak to the very surreal and strange things that are happening in the Security Council and other corners of the UN, including the possibility of accountability mechanisms, for example. We also are joined by Elizabeth Cantonese, who is the Executive Director of the ACOS Alliance. The ACOS Alliance is a coalition of 129 news organizations, freelance journalist associations, and press freedom groups. And she can speak to the issues that are being faced by the primarily freelance journalists that are really also at the backbone of the kind of coverage that we're seeing. So we're going to open it up, and first we're going to call on, we have a question that was posted in the Q&A. It's Deborah Kadin, who I believe is with the Chicago Tribune. And the question is, do we have evidence that journalists are being intentionally targeted by Russian troops? Who wants to take that?
I can start. Russian media, state media, reported and still reporting that there are no journalists in Ukraine. All of them are propagandists. And the truth, and Russia is the party that is bringing the real truth, telling the real stories. So in that regard, there is no consideration for journalists from the Russian troops. In the case of the killed journalists, we were able to confirm that 2 of those journalists were targeted by Russians directly, and in 2 other incidents of killed journalists, the source of fire was not confirmed, although the Ukrainian side said it was Russians. But from the rhetoric in Russia about Russian media, it is clear that there is no respect for journalists or media workers. And also the policies of targeting information infrastructure with the goal to destroy it is a clear evidence that Russia wants to establish a control, an information control over Ukraine, as well as a military control. And I lost the thread of my thought.
That's okay. Colin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think Gulnoza is right in the sense that the Russians want to control the flow of information and the narrative around this, particularly in Russia. I think it is dangerous for us at this stage to accede blame for deaths on either side. We need to remember that this is, journalists are working in live fire zones. There's an exchange of fire between both sides. And, I'm not going to say Russians are deliberately targeting or not, but people get killed when guns are going bang, quite frankly. And it doesn't really matter who's firing them. What matters is the fact that we have people in these areas taking fire from both sides, quite frankly. So the question was, are they being deliberately targeted? I think there is indiscriminate targeting of civilians and individuals who are not combatants from both sides. And I think that's very problematic for journalists trying to cover the story.
Thank you. A reminder for everyone attending that you may also use the raise hand function at the bottom of Zoom. We are allowing you to actually speak. It's part of the ethos of our work. So we have some questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to go next to Jean-Paul Marteau's. The question is, what are the ways of circumventing the blocks on independent information in Russia? And what's the proportion of Russians in contact with non-official information? It seems to me like the second part of that is more difficult to answer because the blocks have been somewhat haphazard in Russia. But I think we're going to go to Frederike with that question. And Jean-Paul Marteau is a longtime journalist and a human rights advocate. So please.
Thank you so much for this question. I think what's important to remember is that the sanctions that are happening now and the withdrawal of tech companies happen in a context in which Russia has been cracking down on both press freedom and internet freedom for a long time. So one of my answer would have been the Tor browser, but the Tor browser has been blocked since December 2021 already. There are a lot of discussions around VPNs at the moment. The challenge is not all of them are secure. There are VPNs which help you circumvent blocks, but at the same time are terrible for privacy and might even flag you as suspicious. But there are organizations, including Access Now, who are providing free codes. A challenge is currently that due to the sanctions, Russians are not able to pay necessarily for VPNs with credit cards. So that's something that my colleagues and Rachel's colleagues are closely looking into and working on. I still want to reiterate, I think it's important to look at the root cause. And one of them, in addition to the existing crackdown, is the fact that sanctions are broad and unclear when it comes to the role of tech companies. And that the letter that we signed together with 40 organizations calls for exemptions specifically around making sure that people continue to have access to information. And this is incredibly crucial that we continue to push on this.
Thank you, Frederike. We will put a link to that letter in the chat. It's a very important letter. Rachel, you have something to add to that?
Yes, I would like to add that one way to help make sure that people in Russia get accurate information about the war is for you, I mean, to the degree that we have international journalists on this panel, listening to this panel today, I strongly urge you to boost and to highlight and to get make more visible in your reporting the work being done by Ukrainian journalists and the work being done by critical independent Russian journalists. They're taking enormous risks, like many of you, They're taking enormous risks. They face persecution. The Russian journalists face persecution. Their families face persecution. The more you can boost their work and recognize their work, I think the better chance we have that people in Russia will get accurate information.
Thank you, Rachel. We have 2 anonymous questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask those people to please raise their hands and/or identify themselves. We really want to make sure that we take questions and know where they're coming from. So we have a question here from Gabriela Sotomayor. I do not know Gabriela's affiliation. But her question is, do you have reports of how many Russian journalists are resigning from Russian media? Are there reprisals against them? And I'm going to go to Gulnoza with that question, please.
In terms of how many Russian journalists resigning, I don't have the stats. We know that there have been hundreds, probably it's safe to say that hundreds of Russian journalists who have been fleeing Russia since even before the war started. Just a few days before, we started hearing about journalists trying to find ways to Europe because they knew the war was imminent. And until today, we have received many requests from Russian journalists relocating elsewhere. Some because their media outlets have been closed down and social media accounts have been blocked. As you know, very important media outlets such as Echo of Moscow and Rain TV are not operating anymore. And from foreign media outlets or foreign-based media outlets like BBC, Meduza, RFRL, and local ones like Media Zona, Over There Info, and even region-focused ones like the Caucasus North are now inaccessible in Russia. So you have to use VPNs if you want to access them. And these media outlets have been evacuating their staffers, not only journalists, but other staff members from Russia to other countries.
Thank you, Gulnoza. We still have these anonymous questions on here. I think one of them has already been answered a bit. But we have one here about how are you advising media organizations to act and or be prepared to act when their journalists are arrested in Russia, Belarus, etc., in connection with their reporting of events related to the invasion? Actually, that's not anonymous. That's a question from Rebecca McKinnon, who is head of advocacy at Wikipedia, maybe I'm mixing them up. Gulnoza, do you want to say something about that? And perhaps if someone else wants to jump in after, thank you.
Since the Russian parliament adopted a new legislation on so-called fakes, and Putin signed it, and the law went into effect on March 4th. Russian journalists we've been speaking to have been frightened. Some made a very clear decision not to call the war a war or not to use the word invasion when reporting on these so-called special operation in Ukraine, like Novaya Gazeta made that decision. And it remains one of the last bastions of independent press. When it comes to this legislation or the legislation on protests that can be used in regards of any journalist who covers protests, just covers as a journalist, not participates in protests, then we know how arbitrary the use of Russian laws have been practically for as long as Putin has been in power. And Russia wants to contain a very strict censorship on reporting on the war. It wants to continue to distribute the Kremlin-approved narrative, and it is going to punish all those who are not were not reporting in line with the official established narrative. So journalists who, some of them said we can't do it, and they decided to flee. Others, as I said, made a decision that it's important for them to report independently on some issues, like the Bell said they will continue to report on the impact of economic sanctions on Russia, because it's a very important story for all Russians, for every single Russian. And other media outlets have been using different words to describe the situation in Ukraine. Does it answer your question?
I'm not seeing any response there. Okay, thank you very much. Actually, Rebecca is coming back into the Q&A, asking about specifically what people do when they get arrested. So I see that Lucy would like to add a response to that. And just to clarify, Rebecca McKinnon is also a CPJ board member and is with Wikimedia. She would like to know what their news organizations do. Folks, I'm reading all of this out because we have simultaneous interpretation, and I would urge those asking questions to raise their hand. Rebecca would like to know if publicity is helpful or harmful. Just as a general statement, the position that we take in terms of publicity, in terms of advocacy, high-profile public engagement on individual cases, it very much depends on the case and the circumstances around them and the safety of the individual journalists, their news outlets, family. All of these components play a role in how we deal with specific cases and the level of publicity that we bring to them. I think that's a general human rights approach of do no harm. So I'm going to go very quickly to Lucy, and then we have a number of other things to respond.
Thank you, Gypsy. Thank you, Rebecca, for that question. I just wanted to jump in very quickly because CPJ does have specific safety information on our website for journalists in the event of an arrest or a detention. I will put a link in the chat, but it goes over some basic ways that you can protect your physical and digital safety. I will not go through the entire note because I encourage everyone to read it. It is available in Russian and Ukrainian, but some of the key information in there is to prepare your devices ahead of time. There's information in the note about how to do that, and to make sure that you have legal contacts to hand and to have your press credentials on you at all times as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Just to note that in the Q&A, we have a question from Tommy Walkers with PBS NewsHour, and that question has been answered by Frederike in the Q&A. So if you would like to take a look, that would be useful. The question is about the role of Telegram in this war and how it has been used in pro-Russia disinformation campaigns. Frederike has actually provided a private answer there. So maybe Frederike, do you want to say a few words so that everyone benefits from your response?
Sorry, apologies, I clicked the wrong button. No, the answer was we're not tracking disinformation systematically. What we have looked at is how the policy steps that platforms have taken in response to disinformation. And Telegram is infamous for being very opaque about the actions they take. So it's impossible for us to see from the outside what actions they've been taken, whether they're taken consistently, and whether they're also in line with their human rights responsibilities. The Shoreline Center has been monitoring this issue systematically, so I encourage you to view their resources. And then I wanted to add, while all of social media and some places particularly are known for disinformation, they're also important resources for fact-finding and for our digital investigations team that then finds videos that they verify for their truthfulness. So that's why it's so important that platforms get the nuance right, that they preserve content that that they preserve content that is evidence of, for instance, war crimes, but at the same time that they also fulfill their responsibilities when it comes to harmful content. And some forms of disinformation really fall under that category.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I'm just going to go for a minute to Lou Charbonneau and ask about some quick reactions that have taken place within the UN system to set up investigative mechanisms and to try to respond to what is being seen as an onslaught against civilians in this war.
Thanks, Gypsy, and I'll be quick. I'll try to, just give a quick overview of the good and the bad and the ugly of what's been happening at the UN. Starting with the ugly, the UN Security Council has been completely deadlocked, which is no surprise because Russia is a permanent member of the council and can veto anything. It did exactly that with a resolution late last month, which would have condemned the invasion and called for an end to it and return of Russian troops to Russia. Then that was brought to the General Assembly, a new version of that resolution, which was overwhelmingly adopted by the UN membership. 141 countries voted in favor of it, and there were only 5 against it. So really strong response from there. And the Human Rights Council in Geneva had an urgent debate about the situation in Ukraine and has established a commission of inquiry, which is very important. They basically did something that is, exactly what you're talking about, and will hopefully open the door to accountability and will feed in to another important development, which is the International Criminal Court's investigation of the situation in Ukraine. And the ICC will be looking at, all parties to the conflict. But at this point, we certainly hope that the Commission of Inquiry can, as it gathers information and evidence, will be able to feed into what the ICC is doing. And then we, of course, have individual governments that can do universal jurisdiction prosecutions, as we've seen in other cases. There are a lot of other things that are going on. There's been, negotiations on a humanitarian resolution in the Security Council that's sort of gone nowhere and is moving to the General Assembly. But the important thing is that the General Assembly has spoken, which is, in a way, the world's parliament, has called for the protection of civilians. And as everyone's made clear today, that includes journalists reporting on the conflict. And so the international community has spoken loudly and clearly, and I hope that Russia and Ukraine, of course, since they're a party to the conflict, will heed those words that they got from the General Assembly, and that the Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry will be up and running quickly and can, gather and preserve evidence that will be used for prosecutions.
Thank you, Lou. You spoke about the Commission of Inquiry, and journalists are obviously playing a role as frontline witnesses to history. So I'm going to go to Colin for a minute, because that ability to document, to record, to convey some of these violations that will eventually be held to account depend on journalists being able to do their work, and that depends also on their ability to operate on the ground. There is a very acute shortage of personal protective equipment, and I would just like to ask Colin to say a little bit about that, and after that we'll go to Elizabeth with ACOS to talk about freelancers for a minute.
Sure, and I mean, that's a very good point, Gypsy. I think you can see the blackout in certain parts of the country where journalists are not operating. So in Donetsk, Luhansk, on the line of control, where there are very few, if any, international or local journalists, we just don't know what's happening, quite frankly. And it's based on social media, and which we don't know if it's true. Where in other parts of the country, we have a better picture. In terms of the shortage of body armor and the shortage of chemical, biological, and radiation equipment, unfortunately, this is a knock-on effect of the pandemic. A number of manufacturers realigned their supply chains to produce equipment for the pandemic, and now they are scrabbling to change back to a wartime footing, if you want, and produce the equipment that they've always produced. This creates a lag time in supply. There's not a lot of this kit sitting on shelves around the world waiting to be sold. And the end result is that journalists do not have the protective equipment that they need to cross the border from Western countries into Ukraine to withstand, small arms fire or shrapnel and things like that. And if you look at what happened to the Sky News team, Stuart Ramsey's team that came under fire in Kiev, the cameraman took bullets to the flak jacket, and it saved his life. So, this is life-preserving equipment, and we just don't have enough of it, and there's a massive shortage of it, and it's causing massive problems for us.
Thank you very much, Colin. There is obviously a great deal of urgency to this, especially as the conflict drags out for longer.
And sorry, just one thing to add, Gypsy.
Please.
The most important thing here, I think, or not the most important thing, but one of the important things to note is international journalists have this equipment for the most part. Local journalists, drivers, and facilitators do not. So often you're sitting in a vehicle, and one person is wearing a flak jacket and another is not. News organizations are trying their best to provide this, but we're short. Across the board, we're short.
Thank you very much, Colin. It's a very grim reality, and people need to remember that as we consider the support that's needed for this work. I'm going to go now to Elizabeth Cantonese of the ACOS Alliance, precisely because of this marked difference that was made about the protection levels that journalists have when they're freelancers, when they're local, etc. And we know also that, unfortunately, some news organizations have had to sort of go out of business. What happens also during conflict is that people who were employed become freelancers somewhere else, etc. And so there is a large number of freelancers. There are many affected by this situation. And I wanted to go to Elizabeth for a moment to speak to us about that situation, about her organization's role in making sure that they are protected and supported and are able to do the work, because what matters is that they're able to do the work that they want to do and that we all need them to do.
Thank you, Gypsy, and thank you for having me. The ACOS Alliance issued a statement calling on international news organizations and freelancers to adhere to the ACOS principles and to basically report this war ethically and professionally. And we know of many, many international freelance journalists and media crews that are doing this from the very beginning, but we've also heard of major breaches when it comes to the coverage of the war. We understand that the war is a very powerful magnet for international journalists, freelancers in particular, but you heard from Colin, this is an old school war, and basically it requires not only PPE, but also hostile environment and first aid training, but also, and even equally important or even more in this case, experience and the full backup of a news organization. And we really expect international news organizations support these freelance journalists to be able to, we very explicitly explain in this statement in the ACOS principles what exactly it means to fully support a freelance journalist. And it goes from insurance to safe communications, to having cash in hand, to have access to security information, and really would like to see how international organizations are committing to work these, to cover this war ethically. Unfortunately, we not always see it, and we keep Colin very busy and CPJ very busy, unfortunately. But it is a responsibility. It is a responsibility that, you know, in a way, international journalists choose to be there as opposed to the local journalists. And that's why that responsibility weighs so heavily on them. They chose to be there, and they need to be fully prepared and experienced to really, you know, take that commission. I'm only going to add one extra thing, which is that we, of course, we expect news organizations, international news organizations, to look after those freelancers, but also those that have been injured, those that have been killed. ACOS stands for a culture of safety. Culture of safety doesn't spare anyone, whether you're a local journalist, whether you're a fixer, a producer, a driver, a translator, exactly what you were saying, and what Colin was saying, you know, having an international crew fully prepared and your translator next to you, risking his or her life without the basic equipment that it requires to do this job. And this is something that we are really strongly advocating for, together with all the more than 120 signatories of the ACOS Alliance. Thank you.
And sorry, Gypsy, can I just jump in on something that
please
Elizabeth's saying? Sorry to waffle on, but a very important point is insurance. And we're seeing something happening that we've never seen before. Small organizations, whether they be journalists, security companies, humanitarian organizations, are having their insurance pulled by the insurance markets, which means they cannot send people into Ukraine and expect that those people to be compensated if they're injured or killed. Now, I'm not blaming the insurance markets. This might look at a very bad bet for them after the pandemic, where they've taken huge losses. But as an industry and as a support network, including humanitarian organizations, this is a problem that needs to be resolved, and it needs sort of government and international intervention, because how do you send humanitarian workers into a war zone if they can't be insured? How do you send journalists? How do you ask people to take that risk? And how do you ask local Ukrainians helping us to take those risks? You know, the insurance markets are about making money and profit, and they can't be asked to underwrite this just by themselves. So we actually need a sort of international effort to address this issue, because it will grind any support for the Ukrainian people to a halt pretty quickly.
Thank you, Colin. Elizabeth has something to add as well. Thank you.
Yes, very much in line with what Colin is saying. Absolutely right. We, the ACOS Alliance, it's something that we've been working for a very long time. There is an insurance scheme that actually has been picking up very, very highly over the last few weeks, that insures every single one, every single media worker inside of the Ukraine, regardless of your nationality, whether you're, you know, a foreigner coming to cover the war, or whether you are an inside, you know, a media worker inside of the country. It is a very basic insurance, by all means. I don't want to say this is the magic wand, but it is a very basic insurance that would cover accidental death and accident. So there is some insurance out there available, and because there is an insurance, we really feel that there is no excuse for anyone not to be insured right now when you're covering the war. And it can be purchased, you know, by individuals or by news organizations. News organizations can actually insure their drivers by the day through these insurance policies.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask whether there is another set of questions from the audience. I'm not seeing any. So I think we're almost at an hour and we are getting ready to close. Does anyone else have anything to add or anything that you would like to say? Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this briefing. I hope that it was useful to everyone who logged on. Please note that there will be a recording made available later on CPJ's YouTube channel. There are links in the chat. We remain available to you for any questions or queries. You may contact us at press@cpj.org. We will forward anything to Human Rights Watch. I don't have an email address at hand at the moment, but we will forward anything to our colleagues at Human Rights Watch that comes in for them. And we look forward to keeping you engaged in the details and the hurdles involved in this conflict as we continue to cover the war and as we continue to try to help and make sure that that the world understands the reality that the Ukrainian people are facing and the broader fallout. Thank you, and until we meet again, goodbye.